He bought a tiny old house, and the whole town laughed at him. But no one expected what he would find in the official's office, and how it would change everything. See how his struggle ended. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The evening light was already sinking behind the dense line of pines when Aaron Miller's old sedan rattled its way down the narrow gravel road that led toward the edge of the forest. The farther he drove, the more the world behind him seemed to disappear, swallowed by a silence that was thicker than he expected and far more absolute than anything he had known in the city. The air smelled of wet bark and earth, and each gust of wind carried the coolness of deep woods untouched by time. When the road finally curved into a small clearing and the shack came into view, Aaron stopped the engine and simply stared, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, as though he needed to remind himself that he was really here. The structure looked even worse than in the online listing. The roof was a patchwork of rusted metal sheets, some bowed inward, others bent upward like broken ribs. Large sections were covered in dark streaks, where rain had carved its way through decades of decay. The walls sagged, each plank swollen, warped, or rotted through. Moss crawled along the base like a slow infection. The door, askew and barely hanging on one hinge, seemed to slump forward in resignation. This was not a house. It was a skeleton of a shelter, a memory of something that might have been useful long ago, but had surrendered to time. Aaron stepped out of the car, boots crunching on gravel as he walked slowly toward the shack. With each step, he felt a strange mix of dread and determination. He reached the door and pushed it lightly. It responded with a groan so long and low it sounded like a warning. Inside, the air was stale. The darkness interrupted only by thin beams of fading daylight slipping between the warped planks. The floor dipped in unexpected places. Old newspapers from the late 80s lay curled in the corners, stiff with dust, while mice droppings dotted the edges. The smell of wet earth seeped from beneath the floorboards. Behind him, footsteps approached on the gravel. Aaron turned to see a woman in her 60s, wearing a faded denim apron from the small general store he had passed earlier. Her eyebrows were raised in concern rather than curiosity. "So you're the fellow who bought old Granger's shed?" she asked. "House," Aaron corrected gently, though without conviction. She gave him a look full of pity. "It hasn't been a house in 20 years. Folks around here thought it would just fall one day. Surprised it hasn't yet." Aaron forced a polite smile, though her words landed exactly where his doubts were growing roots. "Well, I'm hoping to change that." The woman wished him luck in the tone one might use for someone boarding a sinking ship, then walked back toward the path. Moments later, two middle-aged men with coffee cups leaned against their pickup at the edge of the clearing, smirking, loudly enough that Aaron couldn't pretend not to hear. "City guy's gonna fix the graveyard shed," one said. "He'll turn around and run before the week's out," the other replied. Aaron ignored them, but their voices echoed something deeper inside him. He had heard versions of those doubts from others, from his ex-wife, from co-workers before he was laid off, from himself during long nights staring at the ceiling of an apartment that no longer felt like home. But this project wasn't about proving strangers wrong. It was about proving something to himself, and maybe, someday, to his teenage son, Evan, who had long since stopped believing his father could finish anything he started. He carried his tool bag into the shack and set it down. The sun was nearly gone, and the darkness inside deepened so quickly that he had to turn on his flashlight. As the beam moved across the walls, every imperfection was revealed. Splintered beams, sagging rafters, gaps wide enough to see the forest outside. But instead of discouraging him, the sight stirred something almost nostalgic, the memory of helping his own father fix things in their garage. Back then, every board replaced and every nail hammered carried a sense of purpose. He decided to start immediately. He cleared debris, kicking aside old boards, lifting cracked panels, forming small piles. As he worked, he found something unexpected. Beneath a sunken floorboard, tucked inside a folded sheet of brittle newspaper, was a single handwritten note. The ink had faded, but the message was still legible. If you're reading this, you're the next one to try. Don't quit. This place deserves a chance. Maybe you do too. There was no signature. Aaron sat back on his heels, holding the note between his fingers. He didn't believe in signs, but he couldn't help feeling that the universe had nudged him gently in the ribs. He worked until night fully settled. The only sound the rhythm of his movements and the distant calls of owls. When he finally drove to the small inn where he was staying, exhaustion clung to him. But so did something else, an ember of hope he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, he returned with renewed energy. He took measurements of the entire structure, sketching out a plan on graph paper. He made a list of everything he would need: new beams, insulation, wiring, roofing, windows, flooring. It was a monstrous list, but it was also a map. He felt anchored by it. He called a supplier whose prices were the lowest he could find. The man spoke quickly, confidently, assuring Aaron that he dealt with premium reclaimed lumber and contractor-grade insulation. Aaron transferred most of his savings, trusting that honesty still meant something. 3 days later, a battered delivery truck lurched into the clearing. The driver unloaded the materials with the indifference of someone tossing trash into a bin. Aaron opened the first package and felt his stomach clench. The boards were warped, some mold-covered. The insulation was thin and damp, the wiring mismatched and frayed. It was obvious the supplier had vanished with his money calls went unanswered. The website disappeared, and the number turned invalid by evening. For a full hour, Aaron stood among the useless materials, hands on his head, staring blankly into the woods. The sense of stupidity and failure hit him harder than the financial loss. He wondered if his ex-wife would laugh if she knew. He wondered what Evan would think if he saw his father standing among worthless scraps. But then he remembered the note under the floorboard. Maybe you do too. The words felt like they were speaking louder now, refusing to let him fall back into old patterns. He took what he could salvage from the rotten materials and sorted the rest into refuse piles. He removed the worst sections of the walls, reinforced beams with the few good boards he had, and re-leveled the foundation using an old car jack. Each improvement was small, but noticeable. A subtle straightening of the doorway, a firmer feel to the floor, a corner that no longer dipped. On the third afternoon, he drove into town to file paperwork for a formal reconstruction permit. The municipal building was old, dim, and full of sepia-toned portraits of past council members. At a narrow desk sat a man in a dusty blue suit, with small eyes and a smile too polite to be sincere. "You're the owner of the Granger property?" he asked, scanning the forms. "Quite ambitious of you." "Just trying to fix the place up," Aaron replied. "Well," the man said, tapping the papers, "projects like this often become complicated. Regulations, you know, environmental classifications, fire code reviews. But with the right cooperation, things go smoothly." Aaron didn't understand at first. "I just want to follow the rules." The man's smile disappeared almost instantly. He stamped one page with unnecessary force. "Then you might be in for a long process." Aaron walked out confused, but determined to believe the best. He didn't want to think he had just been asked for a bribe. Outside the building stood a tall man leaning against an immaculate black pickup. He wore a hunting vest despite the heat, and watched Aaron with the amused curiosity of a predator observing a wounded animal. "You picked the wrong shack, friend," the man said. "Name's Garrett Rolls. My land borders yours. I always planned to buy that strip. Would have made my hunting fields perfect." It wasn't listed as yours, Aaron replied cautiously. Garrett smiled, but his eyes weren't smiling. Not yet. But you could sell it to me. Make yourself some money before that thing collapses, or the county shuts you down. I'm not selling. The smile vanished. You will, Garrett said softly. One way or another. Aaron swallowed, unsure if the comment was a threat or simple arrogance. Probably both. That evening, as he stood in the dim light of the shack, listening to the forest sway outside, he imagined Garrett's voice repeating those two words. You will. The idea of giving up twisted in his stomach. He gripped the rotting doorframe and forced himself to breathe. He had lost his job, his marriage, and most of his confidence. If he surrendered this too, there would be nothing left to rebuild. The shack creaked in the wind, like an old man shifting in his sleep. Aaron looked around at its jagged lines and broken edges. It still wasn't a home, not even close. But it could be. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he could be whole again as well. He turned on his flashlight, picked up his hammer, and kept working long after the moon had risen over the trees. He wasn't quitting. The morning after Garrett's warning, the forest felt different. Quieter, watchful, as if waiting to see what Aaron would do next. He stepped out of the motel room with a heaviness beneath his ribs, the memory of the man's cold smile still lingering. At the clearing, dew clung to the edges of the shack's sagging roof, turning each droplet into a spark of fragile light. It was the kind of sight that normally steadied him, but not today. Today the silence felt thinner, brittle, like something that could crack with the slightest pressure. He forced himself to focus on work. If he kept moving, kept fixing, kept rebuilding, maybe the unease inside him would settle. He measured the warped doorframe again, rechecked the angles, and cut new boards from what little usable material he had salvaged. His hands moved automatically, the comforting rhythm of saw, hammer, and nails pushing the world into the background. But the background didn't stay quiet for long. A white government-issued SUV rolled into the clearing, stopping in a spray of loose gravel. The man who stepped out wore the badge of a county inspector, though the mild smirk on his face reminded Aaron too much of Garrett. He approached with the slow swagger of someone evaluating property he already believed was his. Mr. Miller, the inspector began, not bothering with a greeting. We received a complaint regarding unauthorized structural modifications. I filed reconstruction paperwork last week, Aaron said, wiping sweat from his brow. The inspector's expression didn't change. Yes, well, according to our system, there is no record of such paperwork. Aaron's stomach tightened. That's impossible. I handed it directly to Mr. Koldu. I'm sure you believe you did, the inspector interrupted, with a voice so smooth it felt like condescension masquerading as courtesy. However, without a valid file in our system, I am required to assess this structure as is. He walked inside, making small, clucking noises of disappointment as he examined the walls, the floor, the beams. Every few minutes he scribbled something on a form that looked longer than necessary. Aaron followed silently, watching the man point at harmless details, as though they were structural catastrophes. This foundation is unstable, the inspector declared finally, tapping his pen against the uneven floor. I reinforced it 2 days ago, Aaron answered. It's solid. Not to county standards. What standards? I checked online. The inspector sighed, as though exhausted by the burden of Aaron's ignorance. There are guidelines not listed online, internal ones, safety-related. I'll need you to redo the support beams, adjust the leveling, and provide updated load calculations. He wrote faster now, his pen scratching like a blade. Also, this doorway fails minimum height clearance. The wall spacing is non-compliant with fire codes. And this roof slope, well, it's practically an invitation for collapse. Aaron stared at the list, a surge of disbelief pushing up his throat. Half of those things don't make sense. This house was built decades ago. These rules are for new structures. True, the inspector said lightly, but since you're reconstructing, they apply. He tore off the sheet, handing it to Aaron with the same expression one might give a man holding a losing lottery ticket. Then he lowered his voice to a near whisper. There are ways to simplify this, you know. Some people prefer faster paths, less bureaucracy. Aaron felt the implication immediately. Another suggestion for a bribe, coded in professional language. He stepped back, gripping the paper so tightly it wrinkled. I'm not paying anyone, he said. The inspector's smile thinned. Then I'm afraid this will be a long project. He returned to his SUV, left dust swirling behind him, and drove off without glancing back. The clearing felt smaller after he was gone. The shack seemed to lean more heavily, as if weighed down not by rot, but by the burden of everything stacked against it. Aaron stood in the middle of the structure, surrounded by sunbeams, slipping through cracked boards, and felt an ache bloom behind his ribs. He had expected challenges, yes, but not harassment disguised as procedure. Over the next couple of days, matters only worsened. When he returned to the county office to inquire about his lost paperwork, Mr. Coldwell barely looked up from his desk. You must have misplaced it, he said, with a dismissiveness that pricked like needles. I handed it to you, Aaron insisted. Coldwell shuffled papers with exaggerated indifference. I process dozens of applications a week. Perhaps yours slipped through. I can fill a new form now. Unfortunately, due to the influx of seasonal projects, the review timeline has increased. You may be waiting up to 6 months. 6 months? The words escaped Aaron harsher than he intended. Coldwell finally met his gaze, and there was something knowing, almost smug in his eyes. Unless, of course, a prioritization request is submitted, with the appropriate support documentation. Bribe. Another one. Aaron left the building with tight fists and an even tighter throat. The afternoon sun felt cold. The forest air felt hostile. He sat in his car, forehead against the steering wheel, trying not to think about how much he had already lost before ever coming here. His job, his marriage, his sense of purpose. And now, even this place, this ridiculous broken shack, was slipping through his fingers because of men who wanted to make him fail. The following week bled into a stretch of long, exhausting days. Without proper materials, he used whatever boards he could, sand back to life, repurposed old nails, reinforced beams with metal scraps. The work was rough, patchwork, improvised, but it was progress. Each improvement, however small, felt like a rebellion. Money dwindled quickly. He sold his old motorcycle, the one thing he treasured from his younger years. He let go of his father's woodworking tools, something that twisted the inside of his chest when he handed them off. He worked odd jobs around town, helping a local farmer mend fences, unloading crates at the hardware store, clearing brush for a pensioner who couldn't do it alone. It wasn't glamorous, but every dollar went back into the house. In the midst of all this, he received a surprise visit. Evan arrived earlier than planned, stepping out of a rideshare car with a backpack slung over one shoulder, looking awkward and uncertain. His dark hair had grown longer, falling into his eyes, and his voice, when he greeted Aaron, carried a hesitant distance. I thought I'd check out this project, he said, glancing skeptically at the structure behind them. Mom said you were trying something new. Didn't think it would be, you know, that. That, Aaron replied with a wry smile, is going to be a real house. If you say so. The first 5 minutes were clumsy, the kind of silence that comes from too much time apart and too many things unsaid. But as the hours passed, and Aaron handed Evan a hammer, something softened between them. They measured and cut side by side. They argued about which panels fit better. Evan rolled his eyes at his father's caution around the saw, and Aaron laughed for the first time in weeks. "You're pretty good at this," Evan said quietly, after they finished fitting a new wall panel. "Did you do stuff like this before?" "Not really. I'm figuring it out as I go." "Looks like you're doing okay." It was such a small compliment, and yet it hit Aaron harder than any insult or threat from the men at the county office. Hearing it from his son felt like light cracking through a ceiling that had been dark for years. But the world didn't let them enjoy that peace for long. 2 days after Evan left, another truck pulled up. This time, it bore the seal of the state's Environmental Protection Division. A man in a reflective vest stepped out, clipboard under his arm, expression already set in disapproval. "Mr. Miller, we've received a concern regarding possible ecological disturbance." "Another complaint?" Aaron asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes. A neighbor has reported that your construction is affecting natural migratory pathways and may be damaging protected flora." Aaron bit back the bitter laugh that wanted to escape. "There's nothing protected on this lot. Nothing migrates through this shed." "Well, that remains to be assessed." The officer walked around with exaggerated caution, crouching to inspect non-existent flowers, photographing patches of bare dirt as though they were crime scenes. After nearly an hour, he straightened and adjusted his vest. "Given the uncertainty," he said, "we'll need to initiate a secondary review. Your construction must pause until the assessment is complete. How long will that take?" "Hard to say. Weeks, perhaps months." Aaron stared at the man, feeling a sharp heat rise in his chest. "Someone is doing this on purpose." The officer shrugged. "My job is simply to assess, not to speculate." He left shortly after, leaving behind a notice nailed crookedly to a post, its official stamp glaring back at Aaron like a threat. The final blow came 3 days later. A letter arrived in a stiff white envelope with a red county seal. Aaron tore it open at the shack's half-built entryway, the forest humming behind him like some distant, indifferent audience. The letter was short. It informed him that, due to geographic reclassification, his structure was now considered within a water protection zone. Any building, renovation, or expansion on the property was prohibited. The existing structure, his shack, was subject to compulsory deconstruction. In simpler words, the county wanted to tear it down. Aaron sat on the unfinished floor, the paper trembling in his hands. The forest felt suddenly suffocating, the trees leaning in like silent spectators. He had poured everything into this place, his money, his sweat, the fragile pieces of his hope, and now the county wanted to destroy it with a single sheet of paper. He tried to breathe, but each breath caught painfully. His thoughts spiraled. How would he tell Evan? What would he do now? Where would he go next? The foundations he had rebuilt cracked under the weight of these questions. But after a long, heavy silence, he placed the letter beside him and looked around. The walls were straighter than before, the beams stronger. The floor no longer dipped. Light spilled in from the gaps, making the interior glow like a promise. If he gave up now, he wasn't just losing a house, he was losing himself again. He closed his eyes, swallowed hard, and pressed his palm against the wooden beam beside him, grounding himself in its solidity. They wanted him to quit. Garrett, Coldwell, the inspector, whoever else was pulling strings. They expected him to walk away. He opened his eyes and whispered to the empty room, as if speaking to the old note he had found under the floorboard. "I'm not done." And the forest, for the first time in days, felt quieter, not oppressive, but listening. The night after the demolition notice arrived, was the first time Aaron truly felt the weight of defeat pressing down on him, heavier than any beam he had lifted since arriving in the clearing. The forest outside the shack, usually a comforting hum of life, seemed to fall into a stillness that mirrored his own. Even the crickets fell silent, as though the world itself were wondering whether he would finally give in. He sat on the rough floorboards with the letter beside him, reading its cold, bureaucratic language over and over until the words blurred together. The structure shall be subject to removal. Non-compliant zone classification. Water protection regulation. Each phrase felt like a condemnation not just of his work, but of his very attempt to build something meaningful again. Yet as the hours crawled past and dawn began to edge over the horizon, the shack around him slowly changed, not physically, but in how he saw it. In the pale morning light, the boards he had sanded smooth seemed to glow faintly. The new beams stood tall, like ribs forming a chest that refused to collapse, and the floor that no longer sagged carried his weight sturdily, as though offering its silent support. He realized that every piece of progress he had made had been carved out of uncertainty, loneliness, and the constant pushback of a world determined to tell him he couldn't do it. He had endured so much already. Was a letter really going to end this? He stood, joints aching, body stiff from a night without sleep, and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of pine and earth and the faint trace of morning rain. It filled his lungs with something he hadn't felt in a long time, resolve that did not waver. He took the demolition letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket before heading to the car. If the county thought it could bully him quietly into giving up, they were wrong. He had nothing left to lose, which made him more dangerous than ever. At the municipal office, the morning bustle had just begun. Employees shuffled papers, whispered to one another, or sipped coffee from stained mugs. None of them paid attention to him as he strode past the rows of desks toward Mr. Coldwell's corner. Coldwell looked up from his neatly arranged paperwork, mild irritation flickering in his eyes when he saw who approached. He tried to mask it with his usual professional smile, but the strain around his mouth betrayed him. "Mr. Miller," he said, with a tone that mimicked politeness but carried unmistakable condescension. "I assume you're here about the notice you received." "Yes," Aaron replied, and for the first time, he felt no intimidation in the man's presence. "I'd like to see the documentation that classifies my property as a water protection zone." Coldwell blinked, then chuckled softly. "That information is internal, not for public distribution." "Then I'll need you to explain it." Coldwell leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Mr. Miller, these processes are very technical. You wouldn't understand the specifics even if I explained them. And frankly, your project has exceeded the scope of what that property can support. It's in your best interest to comply with the directive and vacate." Vacate. The word pulsed in Aaron's ears. This man was used to people walking away with bowed heads, but he wasn't walking away. He took a step closer to the desk, lowering his voice. "The only thing I don't understand is how my property suddenly became restricted after I refused to support a prioritization request." Coldwell's eyes flickered, only for a moment. But the moment was enough. Aaron didn't wait for a reply. He glanced down at the scattered folders on the desk, some open, some perfectly aligned. One folder caught his eye. It bore Garrett's name in bold black letters. A loose sheet protruded from its side, showing the top of a bank record. Coldwell noticed the direction of his gaze and hurriedly tried to close it, but not quickly enough. Aaron reached forward and flipped the folder fully open, ignoring the startled gasps from nearby staff. Bank receipts dated over the past months spilled into view deposits, transfers, amounts large enough to silence questions, all routed to an account under Coldwell's name. Each transfer date aligned suspiciously well with the days his paperwork had vanished, or new obstacles had appeared, or inspections had been initiated at his property. Coldwell stood abruptly, face flushing. "You cannot touch those documents. That is confidential county property." "Funny," Aaron said. "I thought I wouldn't understand the specifics." He pulled out his phone and snapped photos before Coldwell could reach across the desk. Coldwell lunged, but Aaron stepped back out of reach. "Get out of my office," Coldwell shouted, voice cracking in a way that drew the attention of the entire staff. Several employees stood frozen, watching, whispers beginning to ripple through the room. Aaron didn't argue. He walked out with the photos still glowing on his screen, heart pounding, adrenaline burning through every vein. The evidence was messy, incomplete, and probably not enough to fully dismantle the corruption on its own, but it was enough to spark something bigger. Enough to draw attention. Enough to force officials who weren't in Garrett's pocket to look closely. He submitted a formal complaint to the Regional Oversight Committee that same hour, attaching every photo and explaining the sequence of events. The woman at the desk had a kindness in her eyes that helped steady him. "We'll look into this immediately," she assured him. "Thank you for bringing it to our attention." But Aaron didn't stop there. He typed out a post that told the entire story, how he had been pushed, blocked, harassed, and threatened by people who wanted his land. He attached the photos of the bank transfers, the demolition letter, and the inspection demands. Then he posted it publicly, expecting maybe a handful of views. Within hours, thousands had seen it. Within a day, tens of thousands. Messages of outrage flooded his inbox. People shared their own stories of bureaucratic abuse, small towns ruled by old money, officials who thought they were untouchable. What had begun as a small clearing in the forest suddenly became the center of a much bigger conversation. 2 mornings later, 3 unmarked vehicles arrived at the county office. Independent investigators stepped out, carrying clipboards and wearing expressions that promised no tolerance for evasive answers. Word spread fast through town. Coldwell was questioned for hours behind closed doors. Employees whispered nervously. Garrett was seen pacing outside the building, talking sharply into his phone. No longer the confident man who had once leaned lazily against his truck while threatening a stranger. While the investigation unfolded, Aaron returned to the shack. The forest now felt different again, not hostile, not indifferent, but almost protective, like a witness that had longed for someone to stand up against those who used its quietness as a shield for wrongdoing. He worked late into the evenings, pouring all the pent-up frustration, fear, and determination into the structure. Each board he nailed into place felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from him. He bought new materials with the little he had left, and whenever he couldn't afford something, he improvised using parts from the old structure. The house began to change quickly. Walls straightened. Gaps closed. The roof rose stronger, no longer sagging like a tired beast. When he installed the new windows, the reflection they cast no longer belonged to a shack. It belonged to a home. A week later, the regional commission returned to the clearing. There were 3 of them, 2 men in crisp suits and a woman with sharp eyes and a folder thick with documents. They approached Aaron with professional solemnity, but he sensed a gentler undercurrent beneath their formality. "Mr. Miller," the woman said, "we've completed our review of your case." He sucked in a breath. The forest seemed to hold one along with him. "We found no evidence that your property lies within a water protection zone," she continued. "In fact, the records classifying it as such were altered without authorization. Multiple notices issued to you were invalid. The demolition order is being retracted effective immediately." Relief hit him so forcefully he nearly stumbled. But she wasn't done. "The county inspector who evaluated your property acted outside standard protocol. We will be voiding his reports as well. You are free to continue construction." And Coldwell? Erin asked quietly. Her expression hardened just slightly. He has been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of a formal misconduct hearing. Attempts to obscure your permit application were documented. There will be consequences. And Garrett? We can't comment on active investigations, she replied. But I assure you, nothing you reported was ignored. When they left, Erin remained standing in the clearing, the world strangely quiet, every leaf and branch catching the afternoon breeze as though applauding in the only way they could. He placed his palm against the newly installed front wall, feeling the solidity through the wood, and allowed himself to breathe a full breath for the first time in weeks. They walked through each room, and with each step, Evan's expression softened more. When they reached the main living space, where a wide window looked out into the forest, Evan turned to him. It's like the place became who you are now, he said, or who you're trying to be. They stood together in the warm, late afternoon light, neither needing to speak further. Outside, the forest rustled gently, as if acknowledging the victory. When Aaron switched on the lights for the first time, the home glowed with quiet triumph. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it stood straight. It stood honest. And so did he. He had rebuilt more than walls. He had rebuilt himself. If you're still here, hit subscribe, share this video, and check out the next stories on the channel.